In 2004, Darksteel was released, on top of being one of the first sets to have the modern card frame, and being the set that broke Affinity wide open in Standard. It was also the set that gave us the first two cards of one of the most iconic cycles in Magic, the Sword of X and Y cycle. These swords both have a casting cost of 3 and an equip cost of 2. They grant the creature their equip 2/2/2, protection from 2 different colors, and 2 effects when the creature deals combat damage to a player, 1 effect based on each of the colors that it gives protection from. With the release of the newest set, March of the Machines, this cycle is finally completed 19 years later. So, to celebrate, I'm going to look through all 10 swords and rank them in terms of commander playability from my perspective. Now for this video, I'm going to be ranking these swords in a vacuum. So for example, if you have a Blink deck, then Sword of Hearth and Home is by far going to be the best one. If you have a Cast from Exile deck, Sword of Forge and Frontier is easily going to be the best. If you have a Mill deck, Sword of Body and Mind is still pretty bad, but you get my point. 85% of my ranking is going to be based on the combat damage trigger, and the other 15 is going to be based on the colors that it gives protection from. So, at least in my mind, white and black are the best colors that you can get protection from because they have the most single targeted removal. Red is the third because all of its board wipes are damage based, so it'll give you protection from pretty much all of Red's board wipes. Blue is fourth because it has a decent amount of single target removal, but it won't protect you from any of its board wipes. And green is last because if they can kill your creature, they can probably just kill the sword instead. So basically, if I were to pull a random deck out of my backpack, which sword would be the best 99th card? So without further ado, let's hop into the rankings. Number 10, Sword of Body and Mind. As if my joke in the intro didn't give it away enough, this sword is laughably bad. Protection from blue and green, although they are the two most played colors in the format creature-wise, doesn't give you that much protection as far as targeted removal is concerned, and its combat trigger... If it said target player mills 10 cards, maybe that would be a bit better, but even if it did, I still don't think it's good at all. Number 9, Sword of Once and Future. This is the newest sword in the cycle, and I honestly don't think it's that great. It does give protection from blue and black, but because of the combat trigger, it makes it kind of counterintuitive. For example, if you want to put this sword in a deck, you need to both have a creature you want to reliably equip it to, and a density of 2 mana instant or sorceries in your graveyard, and not a lot of decks really want both of those. Maybe something like Baral and Kari Zev could make a pretty good use of it, or Feather 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 just puts them into exile, so it rarely goes into the graveyard anyways, but you get my point. You need to have a really niche strategy for this sword to be good in your deck. Number 8, Sword of War and Peace. This sword is the exemplification of mediocrity. Well, I will give it that it has protection from white and red, 2 of the top 3 colors that I put in my rankings. Its combat damage trigger is kind of inconsequential. Well, sure, dealing an average of 4 to 5 damage and getting an average of 4 to 5 life on each combat damage trigger, especially if you have Double Strike, is pretty good in terms of impacting the life totals. It doesn't really impact the board, which is what you're going to want to look for in one of these swords. I can almost see you wanting this in an aggressive deck or a life gain deck, but even then there are some better options. Number 7, Sword of Truth and Justice. Just like Sword of War and Peace, this sword is pretty mediocre. While it does have a bit of a lower floor than War and Peace, like realistically you're not going to gain 0 life or deal 0 additional damage, the ceiling is just way higher on it. While protection from blue isn't as good as protection from red, I think the higher ceiling on this card is what pushes it a slot above for me. Number 6, Sword of Sinew and Steel. This was a hard one for me. I grappled pretty hard with swapping this with number 7, but at the end of the day, I think having protection from black and having a combat damage trigger that actually impacts the board is a bit better than Truth and Justice. You can pretty much ignore the Planeswalker portion, but if you get lucky, that's pretty sweet. But destroying artifacts, especially against an artifact-heavy deck, is really impactful, and even if it's something as small as like a Felwar Stone, I think you'll still get a good bit of value out of this sword. And bonus points if you're playing against an artifact deck, since they normally run red anyways, you have some pretty sweet political power. Number 5, Sword of Light and Shadow. Admittedly, this sword is getting carried a lot by its 2 protection colors, i.e. the 2 best colors to be protected against in the format, but I think its combat damage trigger is actually pretty good. We can ignore the healing cell, but getting to cast a Disentomb every single turn, as long as you connect, especially in a deck where you're sacrificing a lot of creatures and have a lot of solid value creatures to occur, I think is pretty solid. If you're putting this in your decks, just make sure you have a lot of creatures you want to sacrifice and a lot of ways to sacrifice them. Now, I might get a little bit of heat for this, but number 4 is Sword of Fire and Ice. This is a pretty big fan favorite, seeing how it was one of the 2 originals, and it straight up just draws a card and deals 2 damage. Well, sure, 2 damage can kill a lot of utility creatures that we see in the format. I just don't think it's as impactful as the top 3 swords on this list. Combined with the lower end protection, I just don't think it's good enough, in my opinion, to merit a top 3 finish. Now, number 2 and 3 were really close for me, but after thinking about it and switching the order a couple times, I've determined that number 3 is Sword of Hearth and Home. This is a very good sword. Letting you ramp and growth on combat damage as well as flicker a creature is very powerful, but it's just a tad more niche than the top 2 swords on this list. This is easily number 1 in any deck that has a ETB effect on its commander, or just obviously a blink deck though. Number 2, Sword of Forge and Frontier. I think this sword is pretty crazy. It ramps you, draws you cards, good in the early game, good in the late game. It pretty much does everything you want in an equipment. I think it's a pretty underrated sword, and one that will definitely gain popularity as time goes on, probably due to the fact that it was released like 4 months ago. It's particularly insane in any Cast from Exile deck or in any Landfall deck. Number 1, Sword of Feast and Famine. You all knew it was coming. Given the criteria I listed at the start of this video, it was obvious that this sword is going to be number 1. While there are better swords given the right circumstances, I think that slotting this into any deck as a 99th card is a solid choice. The discard isn't the biggest deal, I mean it can even be a downside depending on what decks you're playing against, but getting to effectively take an extra turn by untapping all your lands in a colorless card is pretty insane. Combined with giving you protection from green and black, the most 2 played creature colors in the format, makes this sword pretty clearly number 1. If you enjoyed this content, like and subscribe for more, and as always, I hope you have a great day.